Hi, so today is our final topic in relation to the Enlightenment, and we'll be talking about Enlightenment and race, as well as issues of slavery and democracy in the American context. So there is a central paradox at the heart of the Enlightenment. I think this paradox is described very adeptly by writer Jamil Bowie. An excellent article he wrote for Slate a couple years ago called "The Enlightenment's Dark Side." This is how Bowie describes the paradox at the heart of the Enlightenment. So he says, at its heart, the movement contained a paradox. Ideas of human freedom and individual rights took root in nations that held other human beings in bondage and were then in the process of exterminating native populations. Colonial domination and expropriation marched hand in hand with the spread of liberty, and liberation and liberalism arose alongside our modern notions of race and racism. So political liberalism, white supremacy, developed hand in hand in Europe and the US during the 1700s and 1800s and into the 1900s. So if natural rights are universal, then how did some Enlightenment thinkers justify their prejudicial views of non-white peoples, such as Africans or Native Americans? I mean, there's a number of ways that they actually philosophically did this. One would be just sort of denying the humanity of non-white peoples, that, they're a different species. They're not even human. Kind of the nice racism quote view would be assuming that they kind of are at a current immature stage, but that this wasn't natural, that they could be changed through education. A lot of like the quote civilizing mission of colonialism was about this. I mean, it would be kind of this assumption that in Kantian terms that they were still sort of childlike and in need of education, but could get better, right, if they kind of consumed and developed Western culture. But kind of the overwhelming way that Enlightenment thinkers justified their prejudicial views was what we would call today pseudo-scientific conceptions of race. And so it is during the Enlightenment that also simultaneously our conceptions of the idea of race come from. So out of the Enlightenment actually comes a kind of racism that we often call scientific racism, which is applying kind of Enlightenment methods of applying science to the human world, that to sort of justify racist understandings of human populations. So we would call this pseudoscience today, but it has kind of the trappings. Scientific racism has the trappings of scientific inquiry. There's sort of purported, neutral observation about different populations and groups of people. There's the development of hypotheses and testing of these hypotheses, and creating categories of people. I mean, this is something that had been going on with the scientific revolution, categorizing and classifying the natural world. We come up with like species and genus and phylum. These are all kind of scientific endeavors, and this desire to classify and categorize, and then often create a hierarchy of those categories. This actually gets applied to groups of people. So scientific racism during this area is really about the creation of biological categories, ultimately based on flawed evidence and faulty reasoning, right? But categories such as, Asiatic, African, European, Caucasian, Negro, Mongoloid, these kinds of categorizations of people that are given kind of these scientific names, that kind of are used then as justifications for domination. So it's really about how this veneer of science can justify ethically hugely problematic beliefs and actions. I mean, so this is not to say that lots of groups of people have not held, have absolutely tons of different groups of people have held prejudicial views of other groups of people all throughout human history prior to the Enlightenment. Of course they did. But the development of this concept of race and the hierarchical ordering of races is quite recent. And the Enlightenment gave these views, as I said, kind of this sense of scientific objectivity that has implications for their longevity, even into even our century. So this project that's creating the idea of race, this project of classifying and categorizing humans sort of biologically into these racial groups, and then creating not just categories, but hierarchies, right? So right at the top. Which is undertaken by leading Enlightenment thinkers at the time, involved, as historian Ivan Hannaford has written, quote, the setting aside of the metaphysical and theological scheme of things for a more logical description and classification that ordered humankind in terms of physiological and mental criteria based on observable, quote, facts and tested evidence. So again, there's this scientific veneer that is very much part of the Enlightenment. We want to understand the human world through sort of scientific investigation, and race gets created because of this. And many Enlightenment thinkers who are writing about sort of universal reason and liberty and equality are also simultaneously sort of invested in these very kind of racist ideas, purportedly based on scientific observation, but not really. So, for example, Immanuel Kant, who we've talked about in this class, while espousing universal human reason in some of his writings, Kant also writes about his view on the hierarchy of races. In one of his writings, he says, quote, in the hot countries, human beings mature earlier in all ways, but does not reach the perfection of the temperate zones. Quote, humanity exists in its greatest perfection in the white race. The yellow Indians have a smaller amount of talent. The Negroes are lower, and the lowest are a part of the American peoples. He means Native Americans. Elsewhere, Kant asserted that, quote, whites contain all of the impulses of nature and effects and passions, all talents, all dispositions to culture and civilization, and can as readily obey as govern. They are the only ones who always advance to perfection. So we should think about, how this makes us read Kant in a new light. When he's using sort of inclusive words of like, universal and all humans, really, he really only means, the people that he sort of defines as the upper rung of this hierarchy of races. He really only means white people, right? And how does this affect how we interpret his views? That's something we can talk about. Over a century earlier than Kant, John Locke, who isn't technically part of the Enlightenment because he was a little early, but he's kind of considered a proto-Enlightenment thinker, and his views are immensely important and popular during the Enlightenment. So John Locke, writing in the late 1600s in England, was a major influence on the U.S. founding fathers 100 years later, and his language is reflected in the U.S. Constitution. Locke argued for a government to uphold, quote, life, liberty, and property of all of its citizens, and that government should serve the people's interest. And if it does not, the people have a right to abolish that government, which is very radical for its time. Basically, if the king isn't doing right by the people, he can be overthrown, right? So he's very influential to American thinkers like Thomas Jefferson. However, Locke also helped write the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina in 1669, which was the governing document for what would become the British colonies of North Carolina and South Carolina. And in many colonies at the time, converting to Christianity could actually spare people of African descent or Native Americans from being permanently enslaved. So if you convert, if you sort of accept Western religion, then your enslavement is only temporary. However, John Locke wrote a provision in the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina that slaves could be, quote, of what opinion or religion soever, but yet no slave shall hereby be exempted from that civil dominion his master has over him, but be in all other things in the same state and condition he was in before. In other words, converting to religion will not change your status. Also in the late 1600s, there's still pretty widespread debate in Europe and in the Americas over the treatment of enslaved peoples. what kind of regulation should there be in terms of how people who own slaves should be able to treat them. And there's a lot of people arguing that, that masters of enslaved people should have limitations on their power about what they could do to their slaves. Locke, however, wrote a clause in the fundamental constitutions of Carolina that gave slave owners, quote, absolute power and authority over their slaves, giving them free rein to treat enslaved peoples however they wanted to without any legal repercussions. And of course, this would set the tone for the incredibly harsh and cruel system of American slavery for the next 2 centuries. There was really no consequences in terms of the cruelty and violence of the master of enslaved people. Historians Robert Bernasconi and Anika Mazaman have actually done a lot of work in the past few years demonstrating Locke's financial investment in the British slave trade, and also his advocation for slavery as part of his political theory. So Locke himself was actually financially invested in the slave trade, as were a lot of middle to upper class English people during this time period. And these historians argue Locke was concerned primarily, quote, with the freedom and prosperity of Englishmen, and not troubled if they were gained at the expense of Africans. So, how can we separate out these views from Locke's moral and political philosophy? And we can ask the same question with Kant. Do we just ignore this and keep the good parts? Right? Do we just keep life and liberty from Locke and we keep universal human reason from Kant? I mean, can you kind of ignore the white supremacy? Contemporary philosopher Charles Mills makes the point that the simultaneous development of political liberalism, so those aspects of the Enlightenment like liberty and freedom and equality, and white supremacy during the Enlightenment, so the simultaneous development of these two things, demonstrates that there is an implicit, what he calls, racial contract holding up the Enlightenment project. He says, quote, the racial contract establishes a racial polity, a racial state, and a racial judicial system where the status of whites and non-whites is clearly demarcated, whether by law or custom. And the purpose of this state is specifically to maintain and reproduce this racial order, securing the privileges and advantages of the full white citizens and maintaining the subordination of whites. So as European powers spread across the globe, they use racial notions of personhood, pioneered by Enlightenment thinkers, to justify brutality and domination as the march of civilization. So in other words, can we really disentangle the ideas that we like, the sort of political liberalism, from the white supremacy? Or was the political liberalism and the spread of political liberalism only possible because of the white supremacy? That it's easy to sort of accept the equality of all white men or even all white people if implicitly that means you're denying that equality to subordinate groups. So perhaps we can talk about this issue in terms of the current debates over racial justice in the Black Lives Matter movement. So, we're still obviously using a lot of the languages and ideas of Enlightenment thinking, especially when it comes to sort of, like demanding political rights. So can we actually break out of this racial contract in America, or is it too embedded in our political system and culture to be able to sort of extract out of these Enlightenment ideas? Scientific racism, of course, a big part of this story. But in the American context, we have this kind of added layer that the very figures, what we often venerate as the founding fathers, many of the very figures who were instrumental in creating our country and breaking away from Britain and purportedly founding a country on equality and liberty and freedom, were also very, very much involved in the system of slavery in the U.S. And so there's this particular paradox. I mean, there's this paradox of the Enlightenment, but that paradox is even deeper in the American context, given sort of these very individuals espousing these political Enlightenment ideas. Many of them themselves were slaveholders. So we have figures like George Washington, right? The supposed father of our country, Revolutionary War general, first president, and owner of over 300 slaves at the time of his death. Now, Washington did make provisions in his will to free his slaves at his death, which was true. And, unlike what we'll talk about in a minute, Jefferson, he never actually argued for the intellectual inferiority of blacks, but he did profit immensely from the labor of his slaves his entire life. And actually pursued a number of slaves that ran away from his estate in pursuit of their own freedom. So I want us to think for a minute by a painting by Titus Kafar. And we actually, in a previous class in the Enlightenment Overview lecture, I showed you a painting of his, Behind the Myth of Benevolence, and we talked about it in terms of Thomas Jefferson. But this is a painting of his, George Washington, and it's his entitled Absconded from the Household of the President of the United States. So it's a famous portrait of George Washington, but his face is partially obscured and sort of his body is obscured by a shredded document. And that document are newspaper advertisements for the capture of slaves that had run away from Washington's estate. Most famously, Oni Judge, who was, I think, a household slave, who George Washington and his wife were, from a slave owner's perspective, quite fond of. And she ran away, and they pursued her for years. There's actually an excellent book that was written about this case in the past few years that I'll find the name of and let you guys know about during class discussion. But I think what Kafar is really trying to do is kind of visually sort of look at this racial history of the United States and visually kind of question the narrative of figures like Thomas Jefferson and like George Washington, that we think of him as this kind of benevolent father of our country, this sort of very sort of morally upright man who fought for the freedom of Americans from Britain, and was our first president, and declined to be president longer than 2 times because he didn't want anybody to accumulate too much power. This very kind of noble, respectable man. And obviously the story, which is true, that he frees his slaves at the time of his death. But what does that story obscure? What is it not telling us? What about sort of the racial contract in America is it not telling us? And I think it's very visually arresting to see this artifact of his slaveholdingness, right? The fact that he's pursuing these slaves who run away quite vigorously and quite strongly. He's trying to get them back. And even though he frees all his slaves at his death, he still profits immensely from their unpaid labor during his lifetime. Of course, another one of these figures that probably inhabits this paradox of the Enlightenment and this paradox of America even more greatly than George Washington is Thomas Jefferson. And the third, or one of the readings you have to do today is Henry Weinchick's The Dark Side of Thomas Jefferson, which was published in Smithsonian Magazine, I think about 8 years ago. And Thomas Jefferson is really this active participant in the Enlightenment. He's talking to and exchanging letters and exchanging ideas with all of these Enlightenment figures in Europe. He's the creator of the Declaration of Independence, right? All men are created equal and endowed, by their creator inalienable rights. Originally an opponent of slavery early on, but his views changed on this topic quite a bit over the course of his life. He's also the owner of about 175 slaves at his estate, as his plantation in Virginia, Monticello, which you can still visit today. And later in his life, he actually writes that African Americans were intellectually inferior to whites. So what is the dark side of Thomas Jefferson? And one thing I want to talk about is how Jefferson himself embodies the contradiction at the heart of the Enlightenment, and this idea of kind of the racial contract, the simultaneous political liberalism and white supremacy. And one thing the article doesn't talk about in The Dark Side of Thomas Jefferson very much, but I want to make sure you guys are all aware of, is his relationship with Sally Hemings. So Sally Hemings was an enslaved woman he legally owned and had a long-term sort of sexual relationship with and fathered 6 children with after his wife died. The Hemings family, enslaved family, came with his wife Martha to Monticello when they got married. Monticello being, his plantation. And Sally was actually most likely the biological half sister of Jefferson's wife, Martha, through her father having sexual relations with Sally's mother, whom he owned. And this is actually something that we talk a lot more about now, but was very much part of the slave system of America, was sexual violence perpetrated against enslaved women by the white people that owned them. So, what's really interesting about Sally is then, even though legally she's enslaved and she's African American, she's, today what we would probably call biracial. And she actually, because she's biologically half sisters with his deceased wife, Martha, she actually kind of looks like his dead wife. But she's quite a bit younger. So, Jefferson is the U.S. envoy to France, in kind of the 1780s. And in the 1780s, Jefferson moves to Paris. This is after his wife has died. And Sally is one of his slaves who comes with him. And she's 14 years old at the time. And he and her start a sexual relationship in Paris when she's 14 years old. And he is 45 or 46 years old at the time. And Sally actually could have stayed in France and legally been free. And she kind of wanted to, or at least this is what it's, the evidence, it's kind of hard to know exactly what happened because, it's not like she kept a journal or a diary. She was a 14-year-old enslaved girl. We don't really know that much about her. But, the accounts are that she could have stayed and been free. But Jefferson wanted to engage in this sexual relationship with her. So she made a deal with him. She said, I'll forego staying in France and being free. I'll come back to Virginia with you, but you have to promise that you are going to free any children that we have together when they reach the age of 21. And, he pretty much agreed to that, but he did not free, unlike George Washington, he did not free any of his other slaves, especially upon his death. DNA evidence definitely confirms, contemporary DNA evidence definitely confirms they had 6 children together. It was interesting that the Sally Hemings story for over a century was kind of seen as like a left-wing plot to discredit Jefferson. And, and as more historical evidence came out, it seemed more and more likely to be true. And then we got DNA testing and it was like, oh yeah, it's definitely true. So, actually, there are a number of both white and black descendants of Jefferson that are, that are contemporarily live in the United States. And, Monticello now has kind of owned up to the Sally Hemings story and has actually done a really good job of sort of telling her story and telling the story of the enslaved people who lived at Monticello. So it's interpretively, it's actually a really good experience. If you ever get to Virginia, outside of Charlottesville, to go see it. And actually all of the descendants of Jefferson, so all of the descendants of both Jefferson and his white wife, Martha, and Sally Hemings actually have held large gatherings at Monticello. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon. So one thing we can talk about is how we interpret and understand Jefferson as a historical figure, given all of this. And one kind of interesting project, one artistic project I want you to think about when we're discussing Thomas Jefferson is, is this one. So Shannon Lanier is a Texas-based news anchor. He's also one of the descendants of Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and he identifies as African American. And he participated in this really interesting photography project by the artist Drew Gardner. So Gardner had been photographing the descendants of famous historical figures in poses similar to famous portraits of them. And he'd done like a number of descendants of a number of famous European historical figures like Napoleon. He had gone to American historical figures, and he wanted to find a descendant of Thomas Jefferson. So he actually photographed Shannon Lanier to resemble a famous portrait of Jefferson. But Lanier declined to wear a wig that resembled Jefferson's hair for the portrait. He wanted sort of his shaved head to show. And he said, quote, "I didn't want to become Jefferson. He was a brilliant man who preached equality, but he didn't practice it. He owned people. And now I'm here because of it." So I want us to think about how Lanier himself is embodying those contradictions and how he lives those contradictions, and maybe sort of what this portrait means and helps us to navigate Thomas Jefferson as a historical figure. Of course, enslaved peoples and other oppressed groups have almost always used the Enlightenment language of liberty, freedom, and universal reason to justify their access to the same political rights and equality as the privileged. So, for this topic, you'll also read a slave's petition for freedom to the Massachusetts legislature in 1777. And this is one example of many similar kinds of petitions that flooded state legislatures after the U.S. gained its independence from England in the 1770s. And using the language of liberty and equality that American colonists used in the Revolutionary War, these petitions pointed out the contradictions in allowing slavery to continue in the newly independent United States. And several of these petitions and lawsuits were actually successful. I mean, most weren't, but several were. For example, the enslaved man Quack Walker sued for his freedom and back wages in Massachusetts in 1781. And the Massachusetts Chief Justice at the time ruled that his enslavement violated the new state constitution's statement that, quote, "men are born free and equal." And his case effectively ended slavery in Massachusetts and other New England states. So I want us to think about how enslaved people and throughout the semester, how other sort of disenfranchised and oppressed people are using this language of enlightenment, are in a way trying to sort of push against the racial contract and sort of disentangle white supremacy from these ideas. And is it effective? So, how does this affect the way we use Enlightenment ideas and principles today? I mean, we can't just dismiss this paradox of the racism of Enlightenment thinkers as merely being, oh, they were products of their time. Because there are people at that time who clearly recognized this hypocrisy and vocally pointed it out and had other ideas, and people who were advocating for their own freedom who were excluded from these notions of personhood. So the final reading for this unit is really trying to grapple with this in a contemporary sense. So it's by Nicole Hannah-Jones, and it's an article that's part of the New York Times 1619 project. So 1619 is the date when the first African Americans who were enslaved were brought to what would eventually become the United States. They were brought to Jamestown, which was a British colony. And part of the 1619 project is for us to reimagine American history starting in 1619. Instead of 1776. And so Nicole Hannah-Jones, as part of the 1619 project, wrote this article, "Our democracy's founding ideals were false when they were written. Black Americans have fought to make them true." And in this article, she's really struggling with what it means to be Black in America, given the promise of freedom and liberty within this context of white supremacy. And she really is kind of struggling to understand why her father, who is Black, was also so patriotic and so optimistic about the future of America. And she's kind of having a hard time understanding this as a Black woman, seeing all of the hypocrisy. And really kind of what she comes to is this idea of African Americans and other disenfranchised people as really being at the forefront of upholding and struggling for the very values and principles that America is supposedly about. That really, if you want to point out a group of people who are really truly invested in what these ideals are in their real sense and their radical sense, it's African Americans and their sort of struggle for equality. And what does that mean in the context of the Enlightenment? Right? Are authors like Hannah-Jones saying, that you can take out that white supremacy and maybe not take it out, but can you still sort of salvage these Enlightenment ideas, this Enlightenment project of freedom and equality and universal human reason and making the world better and progress in a real sense? How do you keep those ideas? How do you save those ideas while sort of pushing against, while critiquing, while questioning the white supremacy also embedded in their founding? Or can you? Are they just too inextricably linked? And that's what we'll be talking about.